Hi everyone, and thank you for joining today's DataHour session on effective code review. This is just a brief agenda for today's session. Ideally, we would like to deep dive into what is a code review, what to actually look for in a code review, how do you actually navigate through an entire code review. At the same time, what is the expected speed of that code review? And how you can actually write effective code review comments. And at the very end, we will also try to touch upon how do you handle pushback on code reviews. And after that, we would be open for the Q&A session. Before we start with the formal session, just a brief about me. So my name is Mukul, and I'm currently working as a tech lead at Microsoft. I have around 10 years of work experience, and I do love reading and connecting with individuals. Um, Before we actually start deep diving into what is code review, I just like to take a step back and probably touch upon some history around it. This is just a brief story around the history, like from where the code review originated. So, in 1988, HP actually conducted an internal review of their software development processes, and they set a target to improve their code overall code quality by tenfold. So this was a pretty ambitious goal, and to meet this, they actually tried a couple of approaches, and eventually they actually concluded that incorporating code reviews in the development cycle, they actually save much more money and time rather than just spending that much time and money on the defects. They actually, when HP made this realization, so software development practices were not as well defined and mature as they are today. Uh, but organizations have long recognized making code review a part of their software development lifecycle, and they know for sure that they could result in a positive outcome. This is just a fun history around it. Let's start deep diving into what is a code review actually. This is a formal definition of code review. A code review, also referred to as a peer code review, is a process where one or two developers they analyze a teammate's code, they identify any bugs, logical errors, and overlooked edge cases. So this is more of a formal definition, but as we start deep diving into what is a code review, how can we do an effective code review? We will touch upon different scenarios. At same time, I would like to put emphasis like why there's a strong need of building this particular skill in software development lifecycle. This is one of that skill that is not very much predominant even during the college times and also after that. So even during interviews, candidates keep focusing on certain DSA and algorithm question, but now companies have actually started putting much of their bandwidth and focus on this particular part where they also want to evaluate candidates on their code review skills. Certain organization they do one single round specifically for this particular just to judge this particular skill of code review. Also, code review is something which is not just limited to, let's say, some experienced individuals, some individual senior developers, but this is one such skill which needs to be refined as you actually rise through the ranks. So as you grow more senior, starting from, let's say, fresh out of college, and then going towards more of a tech lead, or let's say a staff engineer kind of role. So code review is one such predominant skill where you need to know how to actually go about reviewing other individuals code, and at same time how to effectively navigate through that particular piece. So you can't just keep on keeping the code review hanging for quite some time. So you need to keep closure on it, probably get it reviewed, and then actually merge that particular code piece into the main branch. So starting next, I just switch gears, and we would now try to look upon like what exactly to look for in a code review. So there are a few things, a few features that we actually focus on as we try to deep dive into the code review. So one is definitely what is the design part of that particular code review. So when we talk about the design, what exact pieces come under the purview of design? So first is you actually identify, do the interaction of various pieces of code in the change list. So change list is essentially when a developer actually raises or makes certain changes. So we call them as change list, and the code review that is being created on the top of it. So we try to identify whether there is a proper interaction that is happening between various pieces of code or not. Does it make sense or not? Also at same time, does this change that the developer is making actually belong to that specific code base or repo or not? So does that particular code piece belong to certain library, and then if let's say we need to consume that library as a dependency. So that is another aspect when we actually try to deep dive into design part. Then also we need to identify whether that particular change piece integrate well with the rest of our system, which has already been committed and which is being running in the production or not. So these are just few pointers that we actually want to see from a design perspective, whether that any change that has been done is effective or not. Then the second key aspect that we actually want to look into a particular change list or a code review is the functionality. So does this change list actually do what the developer intends to do? Uh, so this is more about identifying any logical error or any pitfalls that has been left lying over there in that particular change list, which we don't want to be actually going into the production. So like for example, let's say in case of any UI change, it makes sense to actually have the design screenshot or demo ready, so that for the reviewer it becomes a bit easy to actually understand what is the exact functionality that the author of that code review is trying to get checked in into the main branch. Also, one of the key aspect of functionality is to actually look for issues that could theoretically cause any deadlocks or race condition. If let's say that piece of code goes into the production and it starts running on your VM, so do you foresee any deadlocks or race condition which might probably happen due to that particular code piece? So if yes, it would make sense to highlight them. So we will touch upon those scenarios, like how do we want to highlight them? How can we make good comments on a particular code piece? So once you have identified like what is the design change that is going into that particular change list, what is the functionality that we are trying to build or we are trying to bring in as part of that particular change list, the next key item that we actually have to focus on is around the complexity. So, is the change list that we are making and trying to push into the main branch seems to be more complex than it should be. So, and this complexity actually needs to be checked at every level of the change list. So, for example, it needs to be checked at individual lines, whether we see that um, the individual lines that have been modified or changed or added, they are too complex to understand or to read through. Are the functions that have been exposed as part of that change list or code review are too complex, or whether the classes that have been newly incorporated or changed or modified, they seems to be too complex. So we talked about the too complex, but what does it mean to actually say what is too complex usually means? So too complex usually means that it can't be understood quickly by the reader. So let's say you are the reviewer and you are going through that particular code piece and you feel that there are quite a bunch of lines that have been encapsulated in one single class, or a lot of functionality has been tightly coupled into one single method functionality and can be actually refactored and extracted out into smaller code pieces so that it becomes more easy. And at same time, This also means that if let's say you give a go ahead to actually push that complex piece into the main branch, so there are chances that the developers are likely to introduce certain bugs when they actually try to call or modify that particular piece code in future. So um, imagine that a certain developer built certain utility method and you actually reviewed it, but at the very first glance it appeared to be much more complex than it should be. For example, it might be doing certain arithmetic operation, and you actually decided to keep it as part of certain library, so that in future, if let's say there is some other developer who wants to leverage the same functionality, so they can just reuse that particular code piece from that utility method. But due to the complexity, which you actually ignored in the very beginning, when that particular code piece was pushed at the very first time, you actually ended up committing a complex code piece and into the main branch. And the next time when some other developer is trying to leverage the same functionality, he identifies that there is some issue that is lying. Now he actually will have to spend some time to investigate the issue, find out what is wrong with it, whether there was some logical error, or why the code was not working as expected on certain other scenarios. So those are the things that actually they get caught up eventually, but they will be taking certain bandwidth of your team when, if let's say they are trying to leverage the same code functionality again and again. So it would make sense to actually uh, keep a check on the complexity of the entire change list that has been there. So the next thing which becomes important whenever any new change list has been pushed for the code reviewer. So are there any enough tests that are there? So you need to ask for certain unit test or integration test, or some kind of end-to-end test as you feel appropriate for that particular change. So for example, if the change is related to certain new API integration, so you need to ensure that there are proper integration tests in place. And if let's say there are certain changes that are related to modifying certain existing functionality, so you need to ensure that the current test cases that are lying in the code base, they are also updated as per the change that has been done to the core functionality. So this particular bucket will comprise both ensuring that the new test cases have been added into the place, and at same time the old test cases that were already existing in the repo, they have also been modified for the same. Then, apart from test, there is one more crucial thing which comes around the naming. So, do ensure that the developer pick good names for everything. So, a good usually by definition, a good name is not is long enough to fully communicate with what the item or the functionality that it is trying to achieve. But at same time, it should not be so long so that it becomes quite hard to read. So there should be a fine balance between the two things, that one, the name of that uh, certain variables or functions are reflecting what they are actually trying to do or achieve, and at same time they are handy enough to be readable, or let's say replicated, or used without any logical error. Then the next thing that comes as part of this is around the comments. So do ensure that the developer write clear comments when they are actually pushing certain code piece, or they are actually raising certain change list for the review. um, so you need to check whether the developer actually wrote clear comments. So it can be handful to look at those comments that were there before that particular change list was done. And also there might be some to-dos that have been put in sometime earlier, probably at some time when initial code change was done sometime back, but now probably let's say you added some new functionality which is now suffixing that to do scenario. So it would make sense to actually advise the committer to actually remove or make those appropriate changes, so that you're not keeping the stale to do's in the code base. So because if let's say some third developer comes on board the team and he starts going through the code base, so he will just be looking at those to do's, and he will be coming back to you and asking for certain question like why we have kept this to do. And as per his knowledge, it seems that to do functionality that has been mentioned over there has already been taken care by the code piece that was there, or probably taken care by certain commit that was done some time back. So why is there still a to do lying over there? So those are something that that would make sense to do a cleanup also at same time. Apart from it, there is another thing which is there, which is around the styling. So make sure that the change list follows certain appropriate style guidelines. So style is usually something which is dependent on team to team, and also whether you are writing, for example, in JavaScript or Java, or which language are you taking. So usually each of the language they come, they have their own automated styling tools. So you can actually incorporate those styling tools as part of your pipelines. So whatever pipeline that you are actually setting up as for the running the test cases, so you can just make this incorporate this styling as one of the step of that pipeline. And you can enforce certain setup to ensure that there is proper styling guidelines that has been followed by the developer who is making the change. Then the next thing which comes is around the documentation. So this is this is one of the very crucial thing which is very much avoided in most of the teams and organization. So whenever there is a hurry to actually push certain code piece into the production, usually devs or the author who is actually trying to push or make certain change, they actually try to avoid from documentation. They feel that these documentation, they are putting a bit of more they are a bit more effort taking and are time consuming, and usually developers or the authors, they try to save some time on that particular part. But documentation is very crucial because if you look at the bigger picture, the change list that or the change that the developer is making, so it is not very much confined to the developer, because once the change goes into the main branch, so it is actually entire team's responsibility. So imagine if, let's say, something breaks in production, and or you are actually supposed to push certain hotfix, or let's say you try to onboard some third developer on board, and you ask him or her to make certain changes. So the very first thing that he would be looking at is he would be looking at certain documentation, certain readme, or let's say some G3 doc or pages or any reference doc, so that he can try to make a initial sense of that code part, which was actually being done initially. Also, within documentation, if let's say the change list is actually deleting or deprecating certain code piece, so you must ensure that the documentation is also updated. So imagine if, let's say, there was certain API that was supported historically as part of V1 version, and let's say the team started working on building the V2 version of it. So they made all the changes, they deployed it to production also, but apparently the documentation, or let's say those API references were not updated. So imagine if, let's say, there is some partner team, or let's say some other partner organization who are dependent on those older APIs. So it would make sense to actually uh, tell them about the new documentation, new references, and ensure that your documentation is up to date. So if, let's say, so this is more around updating, keeping it updated. If, let's say, the documentation entirely is missing, so it would make sense to invest some time to actually start building some documentation. Obviously, there can be a scenario where, for example, you onboarded certain team, and there was certain legacy code that was already existing, and you can claim that there was no documentation from the very beginning. So how can we actually go about it? So one of the thing that you can actually try looking for is to do some initial documentation. It might not be the accurate one or the complete one in the very first go, but as you start making certain changes, so each of the developer will have its responsibility to actually update that documentation or add some part to documentation. So you will see that over the period of, let's say, 3 to 4 months, you would have a very good documentation which is up to date, and the amount or the effort that you invested in it would be very much fruitful in the longer run. Then the next thing that actually comes important is the context. So look at the change list that has been there in a broad context. So usually the code review tool will only show you a few lines of code that are done. So you have to sometimes look the whole file or probably surrounding method or functionalities to ensure that you thoroughly understand the changes that are being done by the author, and that will be apparently going into the main branch or the production after your review. So do try to get a proper context of the entire change list. So I'll switch gears a bit now. So we touched upon like what is a code review, what to look for in a code review. So we try to touch upon what are the key things, scenarios that we actually have to look for in a code review. Another important thing that actually comes is around navigating a code review. So how do you navigate a particular code review? So imagine that there is a code review that has been raised by the author, and he just shared that link of that particular code review with you, and he asked you that, hey, please do the code review for me for this particular change. So how will you go about doing that? So the initial idea is actually to take a broad view of that change. So look at the change list description and what the change list does in general. So does this change even make sense to you? So just look at it from a high level overview. What are the key things that have been done? So if you feel that if this change shouldn't have been happened in the first place, so I would suggest please respond immediately with an explanation of why the change should not be happening. So when you actually reject a change like this, it is also a good idea to suggest the developer what they should have done instead. So I'll give you one example also. So what you might say is, uh, looks like you put some good work into this. Thank you. However, we are actually going into the direction of removing certain foo widget system. So imagine the author made certain changes to this foo widget class or system, and you have the longer run idea of that particular code piece that in the longer run, we are actually moving into the direction of removing that system altogether, and you are trying to bring certain modification here. So we don't want to make any new modification to it right now. How about instead you refactor our new bar widget class? So let's say as a senior folk, you have the long-term idea of around a certain code piece, and let's say there is a fresh developer or a junior developer who made certain code piece change. So he's not aware about the long-term projection of certain code piece, right? So it would make sense to actually politely tell him that why not you put your bandwidth or effort into that other piece, which in the longer run we feel would be taking over the initial foo widget class. So this is just one example, like how do you take a broad level view of the change, and if there is something that needs to be done, immediately respond it rather than taking much more longer time for that piece. Then the second thing that actually comes important is around the examination of the main parts of change list. So you already did the first part. You went through the high level above view of the entire change list. You identified that the overall changes that are done are pretty much in line with what you expect it to be. So the next thing that would be coming is examining the main parts of change list. So imagine there is an entire change list, code review that is there. So um, so you will understand that there are certain files where the core logic has been sitting, and that contains the most of the changes belonging to that code review. And then there are some other utility files, some other surrounding code that has been modified in order to ensure that the entire change works end to end. So there are some of the key files or some of the key method classes that where the actual main code logic of that change actually reside. So the next thing that we actually have to go through is examining those main parts of the change list. So find those files where the main part of this change list reside. Um, Often there is one file that has the largest number of logical changes, and it is usually the major piece of change list. And you need to actually start looking at those major parts first. So this will so why do we want to actually start looking at those main parts of the change list first? So first, this will actually help you build that context that we actually talked about earlier. So that is like one of the key feature where you want to understand the context which related to that. And one generally it has been observed that once you have built the right context for reviewing, so it accelerates your overall code review speed. So we will touch upon the speed of the code review also in the later parts of this session, but this generally accelerates that particular part of doing the code review. So if the change list is too large for you to figure out the main part, so it would be a red flag at this particular point. So you need to ask the developer to that um, he should be looking at it first, and then ask them to actually split that particular change list or code review into multiple code reviews. So we will touch upon this part also, why we are saying that if there is a very big change, we want it to be broken it down into smaller code reviews rather than a very big chunk. Because usually it has been observed, if let's say as a reviewer you are spending too much time, probably more than 30 minutes into one single review, so you actually start losing the traction or the main key aspect of that particular code piece. And then there comes a slight chance of any particular logical error to be creeping in into the making its way to the production. So if you see another thing is, if you see any some major design problems with that particular part of change request, so you should send those comments immediately again. So it's more of a like a fail fast model that we are trying to follow. So whenever at a particular instance we realize that there is certain something which is wrong, which is not in line with what we understand, so it makes sense to actually raise or escalate that particular concern early. So it should be ideally sooner than later. That is the thumb rule for that. So another thing that we actually want to go through is to look through the rest of the change list. So we went through the we built so we build the entire context by looking at the major piece of that particular change list. Then the another thing is to actually start looking through the rest of the changes that are lying in that particular code review. So usually those are very minor changes that are lying over there. So once you have confirmed that there are no major design problems with that code piece, and so you then try to figure out a logical sequence in which you will start looking out into the different files where those changes have been done, and you make sure that you don't miss reviewing those particular files. So I'll give you one example. Let's say there was one some major change that was done, and that change also included making change in some common utility or helper method. So imagine if let's say you understood the whole context, you gone through the major code piece or the change that was there, but you just missed reviewing that particular method where there was certain smaller change that was introduced, and that was kind of a helper method or let's say a utility method. So imagine that utility method was actually being used at other places also, and any code piece or any bug that was introduced as part of that smaller change will actually impact or will have a very broad impact in the overall sense, because it will be it will start creeping into other code flows as well. So that is why it becomes important to actually go through rest of the CL in an appropriate sequence. So usually after you have looked through the all the major files, it is simplest to just go through each of the file in the order in which the code review tool is presenting them to you. So that way you will just quickly cover through the remaining files, and you will get a good idea that okay, so here there are some changes that have been done, and then there are a few other changes that have been done in this particular code piece and on. So so far, we have touched upon like what is the code review, what to look for in the code review, how do you navigate through a given code piece. So as we discussed earlier, so the next thing that we actually want to consider is around the speed of the code review. So what should be the ideal speed for any code piece, right? So um, you are being presented with any code review that is there. So how do you you got a feeling around how do you navigate through that particular thing, what to actually look for in that particular code piece, but what is the right speed to actually navigate through those code reviews. So The number one thing that actually comes up as part of this is why should code reviews be fast? So you can actually ask me this question that we want to ensure that we are pushing the right standard, we are following the right standard code practices. We want to ensure that we are only committing or pushing the very highest standard code piece only, so as to ensure that we are not bringing any regression or any bugs, introducing any bugs in the production. But why do we want it to be fast then? Why there is a hurry, right? So let me take a step back. So when let's say your code reviews are pretty slow, right? But if let's say they are slow, then they will actually lead to several things that will happen. So one is the velocity of the team as a whole is decreased. So imagine that the developers are actually working on different features. They are raising their request, code review request, at very frequent time. And imagine you are the one who will be going through those code reviews, and you are kind of a bottleneck in that entire process. So imagine if let's say you are being slow, so you will be impacting the entire velocity of the team, because now they all are being dependent on your code review, your comments, your feedback. And unless you provide a good to go, that particular code piece can't go into the main branch and can't make its way eventually into the production. So first there is an impact on the velocity. Then another thing is sometimes developers also start to protest against the code review process. So generally they feel that the senior folk or the individual is not putting much effort on that particular piece, and that is why we have a lot of change lists that are currently open in multiple code reviews, and they all are pending on you. So that kind of thing can also pop up. Then the third thing is the code health can actually be impacted. So now this can be something that you can actually make an argument that if let's say we are fast, so how can we ensure how can we ensure that the health is fine, because there is a chance that any particular bug can be introduced, right? So um, the code health will be impacted, because if let's say you're following a set some standard. So we discuss about the framework of doing the code review, what to look for in a code review, how do you navigate the code review. So if you're following certain framework, so that will automatically ensure that your whatever code review that you're doing is actually fast enough, and at same time it is of highest quality and highest standard. It is meeting those standard and guidelines, so as to ensure that the overall code health is not actually impacted adversely. Then the second thing that would be coming is how fast should code reviewers be. So we talked about that the developers are raising their code review request at a very high pace. So what is expected from a code reviewer? What is the velocity that is impacted from a code reviewer? So one business day is the maximum time that it should take to respond to a code review request. So that is the kind of a SLA that one should strive for. So try to adhere to that particular SLA. There can be some exception, there can be some violation, but this is one of the key thing that we actually try to ensure, just to ensure that we are not actually adversely impacting the velocity of the team. Then so we talked about that how fast the code review should happen, and how fast code reviewers have to be. But then we are talking about the speed, right? So there's also an element of speed versus interruption. So if let's say you are you are in the middle of a focused task, and let's say for example you are writing your own code piece as a senior developer, or a staff developer, and you don't want to interrupt yourself to do a code review, right? So there needs to be a fine balance between the speed and interruption. So usually one of the commonly followed paradigm is to actually allocate some fixed time frame during your entire day. Probably, like for example, you can spend some time dedicatedly in the morning, like for example half an hour or 1 hour, to actually go through all the review requests that have been raised by your team and that are actually pending on you. And that way you actually can um, create some focused time just for the review only, and that way you won't be just doing the context switching throughout the remaining day between the code review and probably writing your own code piece. So that is how you can actually try to balance between the speed and the interruption format. Then the next thing that actually comes is as part of the speed is the fast responses. So when we talk about the speed of the code review, it is the response time that we are concerned with, right? So as opposed to how long it takes a change list to get through the whole review. So there might be a case that the entire review is taking around, let's say, 3 to 4 days, and then the reason why is it taking 3 to 4 days is because you actually did one round of code review within one working business day, and you responded back with your review comments. Then you will have to provide some time to the other author also, so that he can make those corrections, incorporate the feedback, and once incorporated he will push another patch set. So once another patch set is pushed, so as part of your regular routine, for example, you went through the another patch set, you found that it is now at par that you expected, and then you will give a go ahead. So this entire process from from the very beginning at the raising of the review and till the very last, till the changes are being merged in the main branch, is the delta time. So this might be taking somewhat longer than expected, but usually the to and fro between each of the parties, that should happen more frequently. So that is how we try to gather our information around the fast responses thing. Then there's another thing. So as let's say you start working with cross time zone, right? So for example, let's say you're sitting in India, and then you have a some sister team or some cross time zone team that is sitting in US. So how do you navigate? How do you ensure that the speed is still maintained? Because now you are dealing with a different time zone altogether. So in those scenarios, try to get back to author while they have actually time to respond before the end of their working hours. So for example, if let's say you will be responding with the first level of code review comments by today, your EOD, based on India. So chances are that the next day in the US time zone, the individual will be able to pick and go through those suggestions in line, and that way you actually will end up saving the time, because now there is no waiting time. Contrary to, if let's say you think that um, you will do the code review in your daytime, so that way you will that code review will keep on sitting idle for around 12 hours before the cross time zone author can actually come online, and he can actually start making changes to it. Then another thing is around the large change list, or the code reviews that include the large code changes. So we talked about this earlier also. If let's say you feel that there are a lot more changes in this single code review request, so it would make sense to actually split it into multiple parts. And if somebody sends you a code review that is so large that you are not sure, so it would make sense. Your typical response should be to ask the developer to split it into smaller pieces, and instead of one single large change list, try to have smaller change list, and so that they can be reviewed thoroughly and very quickly compared to a very large one. And another thing that comes important is around looks good to me with comments. So for example, one of the thing that impacts the speed, or that can actually help you uh, speed up the code reviews, are certain situation in which a reviewer should give looks good to me or such approvals, even though there are some unresolved comments that are lying, but they can be actually taken care as part of a separate code review or change list, right? So rather than keep on blocking that particular change list till each and every comment has been taken care by, so you can actually work with the developer or the author. So the reviewer, so there are certain condition in which you will be giving probably a conditional approval with certain suggestions which can be incorporated in the subsequent PR. So one is the reviewer is actually having the confidence that the developer will be able to appropriately address the remaining comments as part of the subsequent PR. And the other thing is the remaining changes that are there, they are very minor. So you don't actually want to block the entire change list unless all those have been taken care by the developer, right? So it would make sense to actually provide a interim approval at least, so that that particular change list can be merged, and then there can be a follow-up code review or the pull request with some more changes which can be actually done for that. Yeah, so we touched upon quite a few things. So we discussed what is a code review. We talked about what to look for in a code review, and then we talked about how do you navigate and a given code review request. Then we also touched upon like what are the things that you can actually try to do just to increase the overall speed of the code review, right? So one of the key things that actually comes up as part of this process is how do you write the code review comments, right? So how are you actually able to communicate your thoughts to the author so that they can actually take care of those unresolved comments correctly in the appropriate fashion? So one is the primemost thing is around the courtesy. So whatever you are trying to communicate, be kind. So I'll give you one example for both bad and good. So imagine if, let's say, the author has used certain threads and you know that what are the that there is no benefit around using those threads. You don't want that kind of concurrency at that particular code piece, right? So one of the bad comment to actually reply back or start pointing out that particular error with that particular author is, why did you use those threads here when there is obviously no benefit to be gained from concurrency? So one is this kind of mode where you can actually try to communicate your thoughts to the other individual. And then there is another one which is kind of considered a good one, a more kind one, where you can actually try to give some more detailing around it. So you can probably write it uh, more appropriately. Like for example, the concurrence model here is probably adding complexity to the system without any actual performance benefit. And because there is no performance benefit, it is best for this code to be single threaded instead of using multiple threads. So you can actually see the difference between the two things, where in the first one you are actually kind of pinpointing the author that, hey, you are not aware of this basic concept, which is pretty much evident to me at the very first glance of that code review. So it doesn't make sense, because imagine, let's say there is a fresh graduate who has written some code base for the very first time, which would be making its way eventually to the production. And you find out few things that can be actually improvised or that can be actually improved. But rather than just pinpointing or blaming him that, hey, you did this, why not do this? So it would make sense to give some logical reasoning, probably give some documentation that is lying on the internet, that like one of the other way that you can probably communicate is give some example also in the same repo or some online documentation that, hey, you can go through this. Probably I think um, this is not the best place to have a multi-threaded system for concurrency, because it's kind of a trivial thing, and there is no use case where we might be ending up or needing this kind of concurrency model, because concurrency itself comes with a lot of challenges in production, and right now we don't want to deal with those, right? So that is one thing. Then another thing is explaining why. So as we talked about, right? So you mentioned you found that there is some issue with that particular code piece. You start giving the comment. So do try to provide some logical reasoning also behind this, right? So you, let's say, as a senior dev or someone in the team probably who has more idea around the business logic of the code changes, right? So it would make sense to give more reasoning so that it becomes more easy for the other individual to understand those changes, right? Then another thing is around giving guidance to the individual. So you find out that there is some issue, you gave the correct reasoning, then it would make sense like instead of giving the explicit direction, that imagine that you put some comment that, hey, instead of doing this, probably there is some Python code, right? So you give a short lambda um, lambda code that can be actually taken care to increase the code readability and improve the overall performance, rather than doing this way, some traditional way, for example. So instead of giving the exact code pieces, it would make sense to have a balance between giving the explicit directions with just pointing out the problems and letting the developer decide on its own. Let them Google, let them make their way, uh, get some learning also as they actually start making changes, right? So you actually have to work as a facilitator for them rather than just spoon feeding them, right? So that is also one thing that the reviewer should take care of. Then another thing is around the label comment severity. So let's say you made quite a few comments, like for example on one single code piece you added around 30-50 comments, right? So there might be few which are really very crucial from a business logic perspective or from let's say performance perspective, but there might be few others that are not too important. They are mostly minor things, probably let's say renaming certain variables, they are good to have, and probably optimizing certain code pieces or making certain condition which can actually help us increase the code readability. So you can actually make them you can make them as probably neat, that is it's a minor thing, or you can make them as optional, probably they are not very strictly required, or you can also make them as a FYI, like just for your information, I found this interesting code piece online and it would make sense to go through them whenever you get chance. So those are like the very healthy discussion that you can actually have on certain comments. Then another thing is, as a reviewer, also you need to have a mindset of accepting the explanation. So you do have much more experience than, let's say, a fresh graduate, right? So you might be expecting that you know everything, but that is not the case, because in technical world, usually you will see freshers or the junior devs, they are much more smarter than you, right? So the technology is something which is changing at a very high pace, and you need to have a broad minded individual while doing the code review. So you need to encourage the developer to probably simplify the code or probably add comment, but uh, instead of just explaining the complexity too. So there are two things. So one is you need to be open to and accept the explanation that they are offering, and also at same time, it's right now, let's say the code review is happening between you two, right? So you are in the process working as a code reviewer, and then there is another developer who is working as a author. So he explained some code piece to you that, hey, why I made certain change, why this is required from a business logic and all. But imagine, let's say there is a third developer who comes on board, and later on, after some time, he tries to go through that code piece, right? So he might not be having that particular code business logic understanding and right. So it would make sense to have proper code comments also at same time, so as to ensure that the future audience are also ready for that particular code piece, so they have the fairly well idea around that particular code piece that was done. So we talked about like what is the speed, how do we tackle all those things, how we can write the good quality comments. So one of the thing that comes crucial is how do we handle a certain pushback in code review. So this is like very much predominant where you might be ending up in some conflict situation within a team where, let's say, you commented something and then there is this junior dev who is not actually ready to accept those challenges. It can be vice versa also. For example, let's say you are not ready to accept the explanation from that individual, and you're just trying to enforce your framework, your model, your understanding on that individual, but the individual himself is correct. So in this session we will in the subsequent section we will try to deep dive into what can be done to handle those, how can we handle those much more gracefully. So first is identifying who is right. So when a developer disagrees with your suggestion, first take a moment to consider that if they are correct. So we talked about this, that have a broad-minded understanding. Try to understand a bit more because sometimes it has been observed that they are the one who are much more closer to the code than you are, because you are taking care of the entire team on a high level, and uh, so they might really have a better insight about certain code piece, right? So does their argument make sense? So does it make sense from a code health perspective? And if so, let them know that they are right and let the issue drop. So it doesn't have to be a ego issue, right? So you are senior, he is a junior, and so on. Then the other thing is around the upsetting the developer. So this is also one thing which is very much predominant. So reviewers sometimes believe that the developer will be upset if, let's say, the reviewer insists on certain improvement, code improvement, and sometimes developer do become upset because it is usually um, but usually it has been observed that it is usually for a brief nature only. They become very thankful later in the longer run, if you will see, because once they have understood what where the actual problem reside and how it is actually helping improve, build their skill, and how is it helping for the entire team in the longer run from an operational perspective. So uh, it is fairly understandable. So they do get a good understanding around it. So they do understand that why are we making certain code be change. Then the other thing that comes is cleaning it up later. So let's say we talked about, if let's say change list introduces new complexity, so it must be cleaned before submission unless it is an emergency. So unless it's let's say some production issue and you want to roll out certain fix asap, then only there is an exception. Otherwise, try to push back, try to ensure that you are not introducing new complexity into your code base. So if the change list, there might be some cases where change list exposes surrounding problems also, and they can't be addressed right now. So in those scenarios, ideally developer or the author should file a bug for the cleanup and assign it to themselves so that they can be prioritized in their sprint planning, for example, and they don't lose the track of that particular issue. So this optionally, you can also try to facilitate writing a to-do comment in the code that references that filed bug so that it can be tracked later on, and you can ensure that those changes are actually being done and they are not lost their way throughout. Yeah, so I think that was all from my side. I'm now open for any question around these things. So if there are any question, would be happy to take those. All right. So I'm just going through the sequence only. So the very first question is around how to unify the code quality and standards for for multi-language application. So for this specific thing, there is no one single approach or one single thing that can actually fit in for all the languages. So for example, we talked about the code quality, right? So we can enforce styling, or we can start enforcing running certain tests, but those are mostly language dependent. So for example, if let's say you are writing certain code piece for Java, so they would be having their own styling guidelines and all. Whereas let's say for Python, there might be some other set of languages or standards that we actually have to follow. So there is no one single solution that fits for all the multi-language application, but the high-level framework that we talked about, which is more around the generic thing around the styling and all, so those remain still the same. So it's just a matter of how you actually apply it for your specific use case. So it is just a matter of identifying that particular piece. So coming to second question, it is around just a second. So for how often code review recommended. So bottom line is around if let's say whenever there is any new change that is being done in the repo, so try to raise a code review request for the same. Um, there can be one thing where you can ask for what would be the right audience for that particular code review. So for example, imagine you are having a team of around 7 to 8 developers, and they are being uniformly distributed in terms of their overall experience. So for example, there are a few which are just fresh out of college graduate, then there are few which are like kind of a mid career one, like the 3 to 5, and then there are few other who are quite a senior, like for example 10 plus 10 to 12. So in those scenarios, what you can do is probably you must follow doing the code review on each and every change, but you can just try to limit the audience for each of those code reviews. So for example, if let's say if there is certain section which is very much important from an application perspective, and you see that um, it is very much, the impact of that change might be very large from a broader perspective, so it would make sense to have it reviewed, and you can identify the right audience for that particular code review. So it can be probably some senior dev, or probably some mid-level individual who is actually working in the team. Then the third question is around in agile scrum model, after every dev complete of any story, in general, after the completion of each module or requirement task. So we talked about this. So generally, uh, when you are following any agile practices, so for any specific task, if let's say it is related to code changes, so there are certain states of that particular item. So it can be like, for example, in to do, in review, in progress, or probably dev pending, or let's say code reviewer pending. So you can actually try to track it using those states of that particular task, and usually try to do code review on every change request, because it would make sense to get a hands on at least one developer who is not making the change. So he or she should be actually going through all the changes that have been done. Then the next question is around uh, do we a particular people do we a particular people for making coding? Sorry, I didn't quite follow this particular question. So probably if you can write it more elaboratively in the chat session, I can take it afterwards. All right. So I'll jump to the next question. The other question is around, yeah. So I'll just start from the last now, because it seems there is some issue on my side probably. So I'm not able to view the questions that are there lying above. So I'll just start from the last one now. Um, can the code review be done after software testing? No. So it is a big no. So I understand that from where you are actually coming. So usually there is a notion that let's say we did some initial changes, we did a code review, we committed those, pushed those, and then we hand it over to the testing team for the QA, and then they actually found some logical or functional bug, and then probably we might be raising another code fix for that. So does it make sense to have that kind of granularity of that kind of code review happening that much frequently? So answer is yes. So ideally, any change that is going into the main branch should be going for a code review. The only difference is if let's say you found or you are making a smaller bug fix for any particular QA bug that has been identified. So you need to ensure that you are also adding or incorporating a proper unit test, integration test, or an end-to-end test, so that that particular bug doesn't surface again. So even if let's say some other developer make any changes to that code part, so you will be safe, because we do already have a unit test, integration test lying in on our side in the repo, and that is actually taking care of the entire of all those bugs that have been identified earlier. So next question is around, who are the members called for code review? So usually, as I talked earlier, so it can be, if let's say uh, ideally the individuals who you feel are the relevant for that code pieces or the change that you have actually done. So it can be probably some earlier developers who have made changes to the same code block, or it can be some senior dev in your team who is actually taking care of the work end to end, or it can be some peer who is actually working on same code part, and he actually has a fair understanding of the business logic that you are actually trying to build in. So those would be the right audience for that code review. So how often are the code reviews recommended? So we already talked about it. So whenever any change is going into the main branch, so ideally it should be code reviewed. Are there any tools or templates to document code reviews? So yes, so there is a support for adding certain template. For example, if let's say you are using GitHub, or let's say you are using some Azure DevOps scenario, so it does facilitate having certain templates to be used, so that you can actually document your code reviews automatically. So they, in Java, for example, I'm aware that there are certain documentation that actually help you generate certain Swagger documentation automatically. So I'm pretty much sure that there are tools that are lying. You just have to configure your pipelines in place so that they can actually be run at runtime. So next question is around how is the percentage of time that should be invested as part of development. So again, that will be coming to the exact change that you are actually trying to make. So let's say you made any specific change. So you identified like there is a code review that needs to be done. So we talked about the SLA that one business day is the max that any party, for example, the reviewer or the author, they should communicate within each other. So at max, you can actually define that it won't take more than 3 days or let's say 4 days to actually get closure to any long reviews. Ideally, the shorter reviews should be getting merged in the main branch within somewhere like 1 to 2 days at max. So how code review comments are different from software bugs? Yeah, so they are pretty much very much different because so the code review comments are more around explaining the functionality of certain API or the logical code piece that you have actually written, and it is kind of explaining to the other audience that what you expect that particular code piece to be doing, and whether it is actually doing or not. So you, as part of the code review commands, you can actually try to add certain Java doc and all. So that will also ensure that there is a proper documentation in place that is lying for that particular code piece. Then the next question is around, is there any compliance team who can validate that code review has been done as per quality checklist? Yes. So answer is yes. There doesn't has to be any compliance team for sure, but there are certain compliance steps that you can actually try to incorporate in your pipeline. So for example, in our team, we do follow the practice of identifying whether we are actually committing any credential as part of the code review or not. So that is very kind of a security leak scenario where we are ensuring that we are not by any mistake are committing the credentials which can be exposed to outside world. Then the other thing is around, I guess the code review is considered as quality assurance process. Please confirm no. So code review is not considered as quality assurance process. So the QA process begins after that. So code review is pretty much coming under the purview of a developer responsibility, where he actually wants to ensure that any code piece is actually thoroughly being done, and only after that it would be merged. So do you have a checklist for conducting? Yes. So we already discussed about this in the session. And then the last one is around what are the standard best practices for quality code review? Is there any tool that is used for this task? Can it be automated? So we talked about already the best practices for the quality code review, but in terms of automation, I think we can enforce automation to a certain extent only, because for example checking the styling guidelines or probably checking the compliance process of those code review or the pull request, but then it can't be fully automated in my sense, because you need to have understanding around what is being committed, right? So some other developer human being should be going through that code piece and ensuring that that seems to be safe from a production perspective, right? So it can't be fully automated, but you can try to automate it till some extent so as to ensure so as to actually identify any early bugs in that particular code piece. Yeah, so I think we are pretty much done with all the open questions.